Well, here we go. Another hearing. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd. Just a few minutes ago, you saw the January 6th committee wrapped up. It is third public hearing. The focus of this one was Trump's pressure campaign on Mike Pence in order to overturn the election. The hearing was essentially divided up into two parts. First was the White House's pressure campaign on Vice President Pence to somehow accept the analysis that he had the power to overturn the results of the election using a theory they themselves knew was unconstitutional. The committee presented a barrage of evidence that the vice president had no power to overturn the election, that the vice president never believed he had that power, and that Trump was told over and over again that the idea was unconstitutional, that he knew that what he was telling the vice president to do was illegal, and so did the people around him. But they pushed it anyway. The second part of the hearing laid out more of the danger Pence was in on January 6th when he did not cave to the pressure to somehow suspend that the counting of the votes in order to allow more time to overturn the election. In the first part of the hearing, we also heard that both Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman admitted that their legal theory was bogus and wouldn't hold up in a court. And yet they both continued to promote it. Eastman was dismissive about what the dire consequences could be. Here's part of the video testimony of Eric Hirschman, who was the White House attorney at the time, as well as testimony today from Greg Jacob, the top White House lawyer to Vice President Pence.
I said, hold on a second, I want to understand what you're saying. You're saying that you believe the vice president, acting as president of the Senate, can be the sole decision maker as to, under your theory, who becomes the next president of the United States? And you said yes. I said, are you out of your effing mind? I said, you're completely crazy. I said, you're going to turn around and tell 78 plus million people in this country that your theory is this is how you're going to invalidate their votes because you think the election was stolen? And I said, they're not going to tolerate that. I said, you're going to cause riots in the streets. And he said, words to the effect of there's been violence in the history of our country, Eric, to protect the democracy or protect the republic.
He had come into that meeting trying to persuade us that there was some validity to his theory. I viewed it as my objective to persuade him to acknowledge he was just wrong. And I thought this had to be one of the most powerful arguments. I mean, John, back in 2000, you weren't jumping up and saying Al Gore had this authority to do that. You would not want Kamala Harris to be able to exercise that kind of authority in 2024 when I hope Republicans will win the election, and I know you hope that too, John. And he said, absolutely. Al Gore did not have a basis to do it in 2000. Kamala Harris shouldn't be able to do it in 2024, but I think you should do it today.
And in just a few words, Judge Michael Ludwig gave this advice to Pence. He put this whole thing in context and said that if Pence had followed Trump's orders, there would have been a constitutional crisis.
That declaration of Donald Trump as the next president would have plunged America into what I believe would have been tantamount to a revolution within a constitutional crisis. In my view, and I'm only one man, would have been the first constitutional crisis since the founding of the Republic.
Just to remind folks, Michael Ludwig was essentially the runner-up to Sam Alito for George W. Bush when he was looking for Supreme Court justices back in his term. The committee then focused on the true danger Pence faced on January 6th itself when he chose to certify the election results. Rioters were within 40 feet of the vice president as he was rushed away for safety.
I could hear the din of the rioters in the building while we moved, but I don't think I was aware that they were as close as that.
Make no mistake about the fact that the vice president's life was in danger. A recent court filing by the Department of Justice explains that a confidential informant from the Proud Boys told the FBI that the Proud Boys would have killed Mike Pence if given a chance.
That was pretty chilling. Ali Vitale is on Capitol Hill. Von Hilliard has covered Mike Pence for us since the 2016 campaign. Also have Chuck Rosenberg, a former senior FBI official, former U.S. attorney, and the Washington Post, Carol Leonnig, is an NBC News contributor. Let me start with Ali Vitale. She's outside where all the action is. And Ali, I think the importance of today, there's a couple of big pieces of new information. The pardon ask by John Eastman to Rudy Giuliani, I think, is a preview of more to come. But the timeline today is what, to me, was so important, to see all of the public comments that the president said about Mike Pence, putting into the context of when he knew full well what was legal and what wasn't legal.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, because to me, especially in the opening phase of that hearing, it really very much seemed like a ping pong ball going back and forth between John Eastman and the vice president's office over different plans that Eastman was trying to throw at the wall to overturn the election. And at each turn, Vice President Pence and his team being very clear that they were saying no, that they did not see the legal basis for this. And at some points, even saying that no one should be able to have the power of one singular person being able to overturn the results of the election. I think that was a very stunning piece of it. The committee successfully showing that there was a sustained pressure campaign, both publicly and privately, on the former vice president. And then, of course, those chilling hours on January 6th, where Pence was whisked off the floor, put in a secure location, and spent several hours there. His team, of course, saying that when Secret Service told them to get in the car, they got in the car. But, of course, they didn't leave that secure location. Pence was determined to stay, continuing to do his work there. And in the hearing room, people who may have been zoning out or not exactly paying attention, they really did snap to attention, eyes glued to that screen when the never-before-seen photos of what Pence was doing in that bunker were shown, specifically that picture of when he was viewing the tweet that Trump himself sent about the rioters and about what was going on at the Capitol. Some really, really stunning moments. And frankly, they're the ones that the committee is pointing to here in the halls of Congress as we've been talking to committee members as they've been leaving, Chuck.
Fascinating there. Let me bring in Von Hilliard. You know, Von, Mike Pence is not personally cooperated with the committee. That doesn't mean he's not cooperating with the committee. But the committee's also avoided officially trying to get him to cooperate. It seems to me that the full cooperation of Mark Short and the full cooperation of Greg Jacob has been enough for the committee to essentially believe they're getting Mike Pence's cooperation as well. Is that fair? Is that a fair way to put it?
Correct. And I'm told that every single individual who worked for the former vice president has agreed and cooperated with the subpoenas that were handed to them. And you just saw that here play out with Craig Jacob, but with Mark Short. And the January 6th committee feels like that those individuals have been able to paint the picture of what took place around the former vice president, not only in those 2 months ahead of January 6th after the 2020 election, but there on the day of. And I think the two striking moments that really played out here were, one, that phone call, that about 15-minute phone call, just about 2 hours before Mike Pence headed to Capitol Hill to oversee the certification process, in which Donald Trump, while Mike Pence was still at the Naval Observatory, gave Pence a phone call. Pence stepped aside from his advisors at that time, but Donald Trump made that call from the Oval Office, and that is when numerous individuals, including Ivanka Trump herself, as well as other Trump aides inside the West Wing, were listening in on that call. One of his aides, a former body man, said that Donald Trump called Mike Pence directly there on January 6th a wimp. But then the other part, that other moment there, was at 2:24. That's when Donald Trump sent out that tweet as well after the insurrection had already begun and the mob had already breached the Capitol, in which he said that Mike Pence did not have courage, did not show courage. And that is when those photos show there him looking at that tweet. 2 minutes later is when you then see him whisked away from that holding room down below the Capitol complex here. And again, it gets at that idea of the obstruction of the process, not just the life of Mike Pence and his family that were put in danger, but also the integrity of the system that was to play out, and ultimately what could have been a hindrance to this electoral college process from being fulfilled that day, a constitutional obligation that the vice president himself is the one who is supposed to fulfill.
Carol Leonnig, you're Washington. If you were having to write the lead piece based on this hearing, where would you begin?
I'm torn, really, really torn, actually, because on the one hand, there is a resounding sort of mosaic with all of the witnesses around Pence, his lawyer, his chief of staff, the pictures, as well as his informal legal advisor, former appellate judge Mike Luttig. All of these individuals showing that Trump had been told multiple times this idea is not legal, is not constitutional, and Trump pushed it nonetheless. But the other thing that really got me, actually, Chuck, was Eastman's request for a pardon. You'll remember that Eric Hirschman, who seemed to throw the F-bomb quite a bit in his conversations with people who were making this suggestion that they could just overturn the will of 78 million Americans and voters. He had said to Eastman, I have one good piece of advice for you. Get a great criminal defense lawyer as soon as you can. This is good advice. Well, Eastman asking for a pardon by email is a lot of consciousness of guilt, right? A lot of fear that he knew what he stated it to multiple witnesses. He knew this wouldn't work, and he pushed it nonetheless.
And, Chuck Rosenberg, in fact, let me play the exchange because I want to drill down more. Before we learn of the Eastman pardon, some extraordinary email exchanges between Mr. Jacob and Mr. Eastman after the riot. It is collection number 8 for my producers in the control room. Play the mash of number 8, please, on the Eastman email exchanges.
You ended your email by stating that, quote, thanks to your we are now under siege. Dr. Eastman replied, and this is hard to believe, but his reply back to you was, the siege is because you and your boss, presumably referring to the Vice President of the United States, did not do what was necessary to allow this to be aired in a public way so the American people can see for themselves what happened.
He implored me, now that we have established that the Electoral Count Act isn't so sacrosanct as you have made it out to be, I implore you one last time, can the Vice President please do what we've been asking him to do these last 2 days? Suspend the joint session, send it back to the states. A day or two later, back at the White House, I did show him that final email from Mr. Eastman.
And what was Vice President Pence's reaction when you showed him the email where Dr. Eastman, after the attack on the Capitol, still asked that the Vice President delay certification and send it back to the states?
He said, that's rubber room stuff.
So, Chuck Rosenberg, I wrote down something at the start of this hearing, and it remains, have you committed a crime when you've asked someone else to commit a crime that you know is against the law? And essentially, the picture this committee, I feel like, has painted pretty well is the former president was told numerous times it was unconstitutional, it was against the law, everything he was asking Mike Pence to do, and yet he pursued it anyway. At what point is that a crime?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chuck. So the legal answer is that there are different ways for somebody to ask someone else to commit a crime and be culpable for it. So if you and I conspire to commit a crime, if I solicit a crime, solicitation can be a crime, or if I aid and abet a crime. You rob a bank and I help you get a getaway car. So aiding and abetting, solicitation, conspiracy are all fact patterns that would fit what you're describing. But what's really interesting to me here is that, well, let me back up a sec. First of all, being a bad lawyer is not a crime, and I'm grateful for that every day. But being an unprincipled lawyer and a bad lawyer and advocating for something that you know is false can be a crime. So we know from other witnesses today that Eastman knew that the theory he was propounding, what he was asking Vice President Pence to do, wasn't lawful. We knew it because Eastman admitted he would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court. We knew Eastman knew it was unlawful, improper, because He said it wouldn't pertain to Vice President Gore in 2000 or to Kamala Harris in 2024. We knew that Eastman believed it to be unlawful because he acknowledged to Jacob that it would violate the 1887 Electoral Count Act. So couple all of that with your question, can there be criminal liability for asking someone to do something that the law forbids? And I think the answer is yes.
And let me follow up. When you look, asking for a pardon and pleading the fifth is not admitting a crime. But I tell you, the court of public opinion, I can quote a guy named Donald Trump, when you're pleading the fifth over and over again, and it's combined with the knowledge you're asking for a pardon, you're certainly raising some suspicion that you think you committed a crime.
Yeah, you sure are. But let me give you two different answers to that question. There's a legal answer, right? And the Supreme Court has said that invoking the fifth is something that it's a constitutional right for the guilty and for the innocent, right? And when we are in court, and I was a federal prosecutor for a long time, you can't infer anything from someone's invocation of the fifth. But your point, Chuck, there's also a public relations appearance answer to that question. It looks awful. Now, it's not evidence of a crime, but it may be for all of us taking a peek into John Eastman's brain, which is not a comfortable place to be, frankly, a window, let me mix metaphors, a window onto his soul, that he knows he did something wrong. He invoked the fifth to avoid answering questions that might incriminate him. That's his constitutional right. But who among us on this panel right now have ever asked for a pardon? Have any of us actually thought we needed that? I mean, that's rather extraordinary.
Ali Vitale, have we gotten confirmation that that most recent Eastman email is indeed from the order where he was ordered to turn over more? There was sort of this, they were looking at what would qualify as attorney-client privilege and what would not. And there appeared to be a chunk of emails that did not qualify. Is this where this came from, Ali? Have we gotten that confirmed from the committee?
Look, that's very likely, and the reason I say very likely is because the committee really does not like to engage with us on the nuts and bolts of where these things are coming from. Instead, they just consider it all part of the trove of documents that they've gotten. We know that a large swath of them have come from the National Archives. Of course, that's where places like those photos of the former vice president came from. It's fair to assume that that's where they got these Eastman emails. They also regularly like to point to the court case that helped them get these Eastman emails when they talk about the potential for criminal wrongdoing here, because that federal judge is one of the few people with deep insight into what was in these emails. And of course, he deemed that there was likelihood of something criminal there, which is why the committee was thusly able to get their hands on them in the first place. So all of that is wrapped up in the legal battle, and it's something that we often hear about from the committee members. I think I would turn to another piece of this, though, too, because in the minutes before I came to the camera, admittedly a little bit late for your show, it's because I was talking to Chairman Benny Thompson, and one of the things we've been asking him about today is comments he made that they want to talk to Ginni Thomas. What he seemed to say to me when I said that she seemed amenable to talking to the committee was his response was that they had already sent her a letter. And so it seems like that outreach may have already happened. We know that Vice Chair Liz Cheney is in concurrence with the chairman of the committee, that Ginni Thomas is someone that they'd like to speak to. But a little bit of news there as we see that the committee is still clearly pushing ahead fact-finding, even as their narrative setting right now in these hearings.
It's very important. We're going to get more into the Ginni Thomas situation after our first break in a few minutes. I want to get to you, back to you, Von Hilliard. And there's sort of the larger, I've gotten the sense that Pence world has been looking forward to this day, meaning they kind of needed this cathartic moment of, look, there's a split. Everybody's been writing about it. What does the split mean? Well, now folks understand it from the Pence point of view in a way that perhaps folks didn't before.
And maybe if I could, Chuck, not just the Pence view, but Trump aides who we haven't heard speak out like this. It took a deposition, a subpoena, for them to come before Congress to make these sorts of comments public. That also includes Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump. These are family members here, because the Pence team is going to, if we're talking about a political future here, right, or if I may, the future of the democracy and whether the population at large here in this country believes the truth of the 2020 election, among Republican voters, Mike Pence needs help. We've gone from Ohio to West Virginia, Wyoming, South Carolina here over the last 2 months, and I can tell you consistently, talking to Republican voters, there is a great many that still view Mike Pence in the role of a traitor. Yeah. That he betrayed the country, that he didn't do the right thing on January 6th. And so what all of these testimonies here are painting is perhaps an opening of a door to other Republican lawmakers, even those in Congress here, as the Republican Party at this very moment is determining how they want to step forward.
Look, we may see Mike Pence become somebody that Republicans use to talk to swing voters who may believe he's got a lot more credibility than other more conservative folks from the Trump era. Carol Leonnig, I want to talk about a little detail that I wonder if your ears perked up. You have done so much reporting on the Secret Service. It was interesting to me when Mr. Jacobs was telling us a story about how Mike Pence did not want to leave the Capitol complex, and he basically said no. He goes, "I trust you, but you're not driving the car." Explain what would have happened to that motorcade had he gotten in.
So this is a really important moment to me too, Chuck, because we reported on it in our book, and it's very affirming that a talented group of former federal prosecutors corroborated it and verified it. In that moment, Pence is whisked down, against his will, honestly, down to the basement, which we at one point referred to as a secure area because sources did not want us to describe where he was taken. And he says, "Tim, I trust you," the head of his detail. But you're not the one driving the car. I'm not getting in that car. The importance of that is twofold.
That was chilling. By the way, that was chilling to hear that. I don't know where your head went. I know where my, one part of my head was like, I'd like a follow-up on that, Mr. Vice President. But anyway, go ahead, Carol.
There are two things. You alight on an important moment. There are two things that are really important here. One, the Secret Service's number one job is to protect his life. He's part of the Octagon program. If the president gets killed, the vice president is president. So part of that program is we save these people's lives. We protect their lives with our own. And getting him out of the Capitol actually would have normally been the right thing to do, other than it was surrounded by people with nooses and flagpoles and weapons and bear spray. So getting him out of the building was not a foregone conclusion as the right security move. But the second and probably most important point here is Pence and his team were already on high alert, high suspicion about what is the president up to. And the president was pulling the levers of the Secret Service. The former detail leader was now the president's deputy chief of staff, and basically the boss of the Secret Service, and watching carefully where Pence was. So Pence and his aides' suspicion, although not their assumption, but their suspicion was Pence wants to finish the job, the Democratic job of certifying this election. And if he's whisked away indirectly at the order of the White House, that will block him from doing that job. And frankly, as I've said once or twice before, if Pence had done something different, anything different that day, if he hadn't been so determined to certify the election, Biden might not be president today. We might be in a very different situation as a country.
Carol, you're painting a picture of I'm not sure where they're going to be driven. You sort of add to the suspicion I had when I first heard that, meaning they didn't know who a Secret Service agent felt like they had to listen to. I'm being generous here, meaning who was calling the shot. I mean, this sounds like a plot line out of one of those, White House caper movies that we've seen every now and then where there's, people behind the scenes pulling strings. I mean, this is a chilling anecdote here, Carol.
I want to be respectful and careful and honest about the facts. There was suspicion. That does not mean that President Trump was telling his deputy chief of staff, get Pence out of there. We don't know that. We don't have that evidence yet. Maybe the committee does. But the suspicion was based on completely rational facts in front of them. The president had put a target on the vice president's back. People were running through the building saying, let's hang him. And the president, after multiple felonies have been committed, police officers have been attacked by his supporters, and the building has been breached violently through broken glass and broken doors. After all that has happened, President Trump tweets that Mike Pence didn't have the courage. So there's plenty of reason for Pence to believe his life is in danger as a result of President Trump.
And he doesn't know who to trust. Ali Vitale, Von Hilliard, Chuck Rosenberg, and Carol Lennig, thank you all for getting us started to unpack this in our first part of this show. We're obviously going to stick with this topic coming up in a lot of ways. These hearings are what the second impeachment would have looked like had you had a year to investigate. I'm going to get reaction to today's hearing and the explosive testimony from one of those impeachment managers next. And later, as I mentioned, we've got new reporting on why the January 6th committee now says they do need to speak to Ginni Thomas after claiming that they didn't, the wife of the Supreme Court Justice. How aggressive was she and how involved was she in this conspiracy to overturn the election? You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Let's get a little more reaction to today's hearing from Capitol Hill. I'm joined by Democratic member of Congress from Rhode Island, David Cicilline. He served as an impeachment manager for the second Trump impeachment trial on January 6th. And Congressman, you know, this is the fourth official federal investigation of Donald Trump of his actions, either as president or in the run-up to being president. The Mueller report obstructed. The first impeachment obstructed. The second impeachment rushed. It was just is what it is. Tell me, I mean, if you had a year to investigate, is this the impeachment case you would have been able to present to the American public a year later?
Well, I think there's no question, Chuck, that the Select Committee has done an extraordinary job in collecting evidence in a bipartisan way. You know, over 1,000 witnesses, 140,000 documents. They've done an extraordinary job in assembling the evidence. I think in reality, in our impeachment, no one who voted to acquit the former president didn't or argued that he didn't do what we charged, inciting an insurrection against the government of the United States. They all relied on this notion you can't impeach a former president. So I don't know that any of the facts would have changed their calculation, but I think the Select Committee has done an extraordinary job of really beginning to lay out for the American people the events preceding January 6th, the financing and planning and execution of what was a really sophisticated scheme to keep the former president in office, even though he lost the election.
You know, it seems to me that the biggest addition to the case that you guys made is the more organized conspiracy to overturn the election, right? The Eastman memo, that this was a more concerted effort. Look, I know a lot of us look at Donald Trump and think, here's a guy that just says whatever at any moment. And I think we all sort of, you hate to say this, but if you've covered him long enough, you discount pretty much half of what he says all the time and all of what he says some of the time. But now when you see it put together, the fact that it was such a coordinated campaign in the month of December running into January 6th, that was something you guys didn't have in that impeachment. How important would that have been?
No, this is really critical evidence. I mean, if you remember, there was even some suggestion in the early days after January 6th that this was a group of supporters who just sort of got out of control and were overly enthusiastic. And of course, we knew it was nothing further from the truth, but we now know that this was very much planned, that at the very highest levels of the Trump administration, and including the president, they were aware that the president had lost the election, that there was no legal basis to keep him in office. And despite that, they expected and demanded that the former vice president overrule the will of the people and keep Donald Trump in office. And they had an actual memo on how to do it and a number of conversations about it. It's really shocking. And I think people shouldn't lose sight of the fact this is the president and his inner circle basically plotting to keep Donald Trump in office, though he lost the election fair and square. And they wanted to be able to have the vice president of the United States substitute his judgment for the judgment of the American people. There's nothing more antithetical to democracy than allowing a single person to overrule the voters in this country. And so this is really alarming stuff.
So the the decision about whether a crime was committed is going to be in the hands of the Justice Department. What is in your hands, I think, after this committee is done, and you're on the Judiciary Committee, is what changes to the Electoral Count Act need to be made to essentially create a few more guardrails, a few more safeguards. What have you heard in stuff that's been laid out that you think, okay, this is at least one change I'd like to see?
No, I think we all owe it to the Select Committee to obviously await their report and their conclusions. But I think it's very clear that although every scholar I know who has reviewed it said that the Vice President's function is ministerial and has to simply do what the voters direct, maybe you can make that more explicit. I know there's been some suggestion that you can make what everyone understands to be the requirement that the Vice President do that. That we could do that as well. But I think we should all wait for the full report from the Select Committee. I expect they'll make a set of recommendations. Obviously, one of the things I think is most important to make sure that the people who were involved in this attempted coup are accountable. I mean, that's one of the best ways you prevent it from happening again, is make sure people who planned it and executed it don't get away with it. And I think that's an important responsibility of the Department of Justice.
I'm curious, where do you land on whether, if this congressional committee believes a crime or multiple crimes were committed, whether they should do a formal criminal referral? I've seen all this hand-wringing. Well, boy, if Congress puts pressure on the Justice Department, that looks political. Well, then others would argue, well, if you don't identify a crime, then what did you do the investigation for? Where do you come down on that debate?
Look, I think the Select Committee has made referrals to the Department of Justice when people have defied their subpoenas. That's a responsibility they have in connection with the charge of the Select Committee to collect this evidence. I would expect that the Attorney General of the Department of Justice will ask the Select Committee to share with them what they've collected during the course of this investigation, and I would expect they would comply with that request. I think the judgment about whether or not criminal charges should be filed must rest with the Department of Justice, and the more that we can prevent any suggestion that politics played a role, the better. I think one of the great strengths of the Garland Justice Department is it's operating independently, free from politics. We should take no step which undermines that in any way, but I hope that the Attorney General will request all of the evidence collected by the Select Committee and then make the appropriate judgment based on that evidence.
And by the way, there was one other thing that Mr. Jacobs said at one point, and this gets back to this Electoral Count Act business, where, and I think he brings up a good point, where someone said the Electoral Count Act might actually be unconstitutional in this respect. Should Congress have any role in this at all when it comes to deciding how the states certified or didn't certify? The states seem to have that sole power. So the idea of even objecting to a state certification doesn't seem to be constitutional.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, but I think at the very least, the expectation is that what the states certify as their electors are received by the House in the joint session and the Electoral College, and that they're then communicated and recorded, and that the Vice President doesn't independently get to make a judgment. But I think, that's one of the reforms that I expect that we will look at when the Select Committee is done. But we shouldn't take our focus off what we're learning in the presentation by the Select Committee. This is a breathtaking violation of our democracy and of our right to elect our own president, and was executed and planned with individuals at the highest levels of the Trump administration. And we should all sort of take note of that and recognize we can never allow this to happen again.
No, it is a sophisticated criminal conspiracy, not not a sort of accidental rogue Keystone Cop operation. Democratic Congressman David Cicilline of Rhode Island, appreciate you coming on, sharing your perspective.
My pleasure.
Coming up, more on that controversial correspondence. Why Ginni Thomas, the wife of a Supreme Court justice and longtime conservative activist, and her emails are becoming a focal point in the January 6th investigation. One of the reporters behind that story joins me with the latest after a quick break. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Let's turn back to what we mentioned at the top of the show. The January 6th committee now says they do want to hear from another potential key witness, and that's Ginni Thomas, wife of the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. The Washington Post was the first to report that the Select Committee has obtained even more emails between Ginni Thomas, and this one is between John Eastman, the lawyer who's been essentially the star of today's hearing. in the role that he played in pressuring Mike Pence to not certify the election. Those emails between Eastman and Ginni Thomas show that she may have been a lot more involved in efforts to overturn the election than previously known. After the hearing, Chairman Benny Thompson told our Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale that the committee has already sent a letter to Ginni Thomas inviting her to speak with them. Ginni Thomas told the Daily Caller that she looks forward to speaking with the committee and can't wait to clear up misconceptions. So the good news is it doesn't sound like they need a subpoena to get her to talk. Joined now by the Washington Post reporter on political investigations, Josh Dawsey. He was one of the reporters on that broke this story. So Josh, let's start with, look, the Ginni Thomas emails. You know, you could have written before today's scoop that you guys had with Eastman. You could explain those other emails away as an activist gone over the deep end a little bit. A little exuberant, doing the mass emails and stuff like that. This seemed different, number one. And number two, is this an email that now came from the release that the judge ordered from Eastman?
Right. So what this shows is that John Eastman, who was orchestrating a lot of former President Trump's legal strategy here as the hearing showed today, was in touch with Ginni Thomas. She was kind of simultaneously doing a multi-pronged campaign. My colleague Emma Brown reported on her reaching out to dozens of lawmakers in Arizona. She was reaching out to Mark Meadows and others in the White House. And she was in touch with John Eastman. And Mr. Eastman himself, actually, earlier today online, posted one of the emails where he came and briefed her group on the electoral efforts that he was undertaking. He posted that with a denunciation of our story, but the email showed itself that they had been in touch and had done the meeting about the election. So what it shows is in this frenzied period between November 3rd and January 6th, you have Ginni Thomas, who is working the inside and the outside game, trying to help get the election, taking the results away of a free and fair election, and have it picked for President Trump.
You know, look, there's no reason for you to know anything beyond what we've learned, but the fact that John Eastman, in this debate back and forth, seems to imply at one point, hey, we need to hurry up and file this with the Supreme Court because there's some infighting going on. There's a little bit of a dispute. Right. The implication is that he seems to know what's happening inside the court. It doesn't, strain imagination to connect the dot to Ginni Thomas.
Right, but we've not seen anything concrete that would prove that. So I don't want to speculate on that. I mean, Mr. Eastman said today in his post that he did online that he did not discuss with Ms. Thomas anything about the court or what the court was doing. But there's a number of emails that are from her, that are about her, and we have not seen the sheer totality of those. What we do know, Chuck, is that the committee, as they've uncovered more and more of these emails and gotten them, have now become more interested in Ginni Thomas. I mean, early on, they were telling my colleague Jackie Alamane and me and others that while some of the emails she was sending were interesting, they viewed her basically as a sideshow and did not view her as central to the plot that they were trying to uncover here as part of their investigatory work. And their position has now changed, particularly Liz Cheney, who initially was quite opposed to having Ginni Thomas come in, now supports that. And you've seen several of the other members who previously told us privately that they did not view it as a good use of their time, have also changed their mind on that. And Benny Thompson came out today and said that they do want her in. So what we know is that there are more emails than we previously believe there were, that she was more deeply involved in the president's efforts and talking to folks in the president's orbit than we knew, and that the committee is more interested in her after this last tranche of emails than they were previously.
And Josh, just to confirm, and we know that there was at least one, that Clarence Thomas did have to rule on at least one election challenge, and he came down on the side of Trump, which in hindsight it's not a good look right now.
He did come down on the side of Trump. That's correct. And that election challenge, and has been very vociferous that, allies of his have been very vociferous that a recusal was not necessary there. And he did not recuse himself and has not shown any willingness to recuse himself on anything in the future, saying that it's unnecessary.
There is nothing in the law that demands it. Josh Dawsey with the Washington Post. Terrific reporting, Josh. Thanks. We turn down to a panel that we've put together here, a little big picture of what we got from today's hearings. What comes next? What could be the political impact of today's testimony? I'm joined by Commentary Magazine editor Noah Rothman and former New York Democratic Party Executive Director Basil Smikle. Let me start with this sort of montage that came from the committee, Noah, because I'm wondering, in the same way we were shocked when we saw Tom Rice end up voting to impeach you, like, whoa, where did that come from? I'm wondering if this moment is going to create that sort of epiphany for some elected Republicans. Number two, guys.
Did you hear any part of the phone call, even if just the end that the president was speaking from?
I did, yes.
All right, and what did you hear?
So as I was dropping off the note, I remember hearing the word wimp. Either he called him a wimp. I don't remember if he said, you are a wimp, you'll be a wimp. Wimp is the word I remember.
It's also been reported that the president said to the vice president that something to the effect of, you don't have the courage to make a hard decision.
Worse, I don't remember exactly either, but something like that, yeah. You're not tough enough to make the call.
It was a different tone than I'd heard him take with the vice president before.
The word that she relayed to that the president called the vice president, I apologize for being impolite, but do you remember what she said her father called him?
The P word.
So what's important here, I do think the timing is important here. So that was at approximately 11 o'clock on January 6th. Here he is about an hour later, and here's how others reacted to what he said about Pence. Take a listen.
Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I will tell you right now.
I'm telling you what, I'm hearing the Pence. I'm hearing the Pence just caved.
No.
Is that true?
I didn't.
I'm hearing reports that Pence caved.
No
I'm
way.
telling you, if Pence caved, we're going to drag through the streets. You politicians are going to get drugged through the streets.
Yes.
I guess the hope is that there's such a show of force here that Pence will decide to do the right thing, according to Trump.
Bring out Pence. Bring out Pence. Bring out Pence. Bring out Pence.
A Republican in good standing can somehow stand by Trump after all this?
So in the wake of the immediate aftermath of the violence of January 6th, you saw some very conscious adult members, Senator Langford refusing to contest the results of these states. And Congressman Rice is an interesting case because he was one of these guys who wanted to contest the results and yet voted to impeach because probably he was moved by what he experienced on that day. Primaries so far have presented a mixed bag when it comes to Trump, right? You can get crosswise with him, but it's survivable, with the exception of January 6th. If you have at any point suggested that the president shares culpability for those events, it's a death knell for your political career.
But this, I will say this, Noah, though, this is, because here's the thing, on January 6th itself, none of us fully understood the coordinated pressure campaign that Mike Pence was under at that time. And it looked like what we thought it was, Basil, right? Which was simply, maybe it was a whole bunch of supporters that went haywire.
But as you start to hear the testimony and everything is being played out, I call it what I have been over the last few weeks. It's a big conspiracy, perhaps a big criminal conspiracy, not just a big lie. Because anyone that knows campaigns, the infrastructure that's involved in getting candidates and electeds on the same page in their messaging to put money, resources on the ground. I had a police officer stop me on the way over here because he recognized me and he said, I saw that member of Congress leading those folks on a tour, taking pictures. That looked like a reconnaissance activity. They knew what was happening. So when you put all of these things together, there's no way that you can come away from this saying that any of this wasn't coordinated. And the question now is, do we reflect on this the way I reflected, or many of my peers reflected when we were growing up in the 80s, when we heard that how close we were to a nuclear war under Kennedy? Are we going to reflect on how close we were to an actual revolution and overthrow of our government after all is said and done here?
I guess what my point is are we going to see somebody like, look, I hear you with the voters, right? The voters, we don't know. And I'm just wondering if there are going to be more elected officials that are just like, whoa, I got to get off the Trump train.
you would hope something like this transcends partisan politics. If you convince yourself of your necessity, you're one of the smart ones, you're one of the sane ones. The person coming up behind you is the guy you got to fear. Then you can rationalize your way into ignoring what we've been privy to. There's conspiracy elements here, quite clearly. The notion here that this was somehow really well planned and coordinated strikes me as hard to prove, especially since Eastman himself apparently confessed in testimony from Mr. Hirschman that he didn't even believe his plan would succeed under the scrutiny of the courts. They were throwing things at the wall. Now, that's egregious. And there are clear indications that they're going to run this again in 2024 in a much more orchestrated and contrived fashion. But we should be careful about the extent to which we have seen some sort of a vast conspiracy unfold here. It looks like they were throwing stuff at the wall to see what would stick.
I'm sorry, I don't have that. I don't think that optimistically about what happened. I don't believe that this was just accidental or just stupidness. This is, as my Jamaican grandmother would say, pure foolishness. It wasn't that. To me, there was something larger at play here, and maybe it stops at Donald Trump, and I think it does. But to me, there's no way that you can have this big lie, if you will, and that you have candidates on the same page, you have elected officials on the same page, that you have a spouse of justice of the Supreme Court making calls and sending emails, that there's no way that any of this is happening without some larger conversation about how all of this is going to be pulled together and what the ultimate outcome could or should be, in my view.
What's your sense of where can Pence have a future? And is it does he got to wait? Is this one of those things he's got to let history catch up to him?
I hope he tries to charge headlong into what I believe is a buzzsaw. I don't think it's survivable.
Yeah.
But I do think that he's demonstrated with his bravery on the day of and subsequently speaking about this in very clear, unnuanced terms without trying to spare the feelings of those who perceive themselves to be as persecuted as they think Donald Trump is being persecuted now. He's been very brave in that sense, and I do hope if he mounts a campaign in 2024, he doesn't run away from these events and confronts the Republican electorate with what could have happened. Because as we've learned and uncovered in these hearings, the Republican Party does have a fealty to the Constitution. Conservatives have a fealty to the Constitution. What we saw was an attack on the Constitution. And that's a really hard thing to rationalize yourself around. Even if you have this abiding affection for Donald Trump and a sense of your own persecution, that cuts through the noise.
Basil, is Mike Pence a hero?
You know, interestingly enough, I was thinking about him today, and I said, how do I find Mike Pence to be somewhat of a sympathetic figure today? But I find myself thinking that to some extent. You know, I don't know that he's a hero. Would not go that far to say that. But to your point, if he somehow decides that he wants to try to bring the Republican Party to a place that it hasn't been for the last 4 years, take it in another direction, if he does that, if he becomes that kind of leader, then I think he can garner the respect of more sort of folks across the political aisle. But today, I don't know that that is going to be a widespread belief among Democrats or independents, because they're still watching this unfold. They're still trying to figure out, you know, how much fealty was he showing to Donald Trump even in those final moments.
I will say this. I think you're going to start seeing Mike Pence show up for Republicans campaigning in blue states. The way we used to see Rudy Giuliani, who you will no longer see for helping Republicans in blue or purple states. Anyway, Noah, Basil, good to see you both. Thanks for your perspective. We're going to switch gears a little bit here after the break. Turn to some developing news out of Ukraine. New NBC reporting that President Biden told two of his most prominent cabinet members to now tone it down when it came to the rhetoric against Russia. The latest from the ground in Kyiv next.
We want to see Ukraine remain a sovereign country, a democratic country, able to protect its sovereign territory. We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine.
That was nearly 2 months ago, and that was Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin speaking to reporters after he and Secretary Blinken visited Kyiv the first time after the war began. And according to a new NBC report, President Biden is now saying that those comments went too far. On a conference call with Secretaries Austin and Blinken as they departed Poland, my NBC colleagues report the president expressed concern the comments might increase the risk of the U.S. getting into a direct conflict with Russia. It comes as the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, and Romania met in person today with President Zelensky in Kyiv, reaffirming their support for Ukraine and their support for Ukraine's candidacy to the EU. Of course, Macron in particular has been the one trying to push the idea that, hey, you're going to have to negotiate if we're going to end this war. Joining me now for more on this and that visit in Kyiv is our own Ali Arouzi. So, Ali, we got those European Western allies visiting tonight in Kyiv. What do you know of what kind of pressure did they put on Zelensky behind the scenes?
Well, they came here to show solidarity to Zelensky, Chuck, and, you know, it was very welcome. But we have to ask the question, what kind of pressure are they putting on behind them? Look, they put a show of support. They said that they want Ukraine to win this war, that it's an unjust war. But many people here in Ukraine are worried that that may have just been a symbolic visit, a photo op for them. Zelensky had said before that, you know, the European leaders keep talking about Ukraine being part of the European family, and now it's time to show that those are not just words. So people are really hanging on to see how they follow through with a lot of the stuff they've promised. Look, they're saying here that the Germans promised them tanks. They haven't delivered them. And Macron is a pretty unpopular person here, Chuck. I mean, those comments he made about Russia not needing to be humiliated went down very badly here. He'd said before that it may take decades for Ukraine to join the European Union. So they're very skeptical about this visit, and they want to see action rather than words. So they're going to be following the European Union, especially Macron, very closely to see if they deliver arms and if they support them to joining the European Union.
And very quickly, Ali, we know that President Biden...
Chuck, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, you go ahead and finish.
Yeah, also today we spoke to a former defense minister of Zelensky, and he made some really interesting comments, Chuck, today. He said, you know, there's 36,000 rounds of ammunition that the U.S. has promised them. That's all very well, but that will probably be gone in a week because the Russians are using 30 or 40,000 rounds almost on a daily basis in the Luhansk area. So they're saying that kind of aid, they need it weekly, not in these, you know, long stretches in between them.
And very quickly, Ali, the news that President Biden wants to ratchet back the tough rhetoric on Russia. I don't think Zelensky wants to hear that.
That's the last thing he wanted to hear, and I can tell you, Chuck, there was a lot of disappointment here because people here really rely on the U.S., and they were a little surprised about Biden's comments. They were a little thrown off at the beginning. They didn't believe that he had said it, and when it all got revealed, there was a big dose of disappointment here in Ukraine.
Well, and as you recall, Ali Arouzi, as always, sir, thank you. As you recall, the president himself in Poland ad-libbed a line at the end of that speech in supporting Kyiv, and he said, my God, this man cannot remain in power, referring to Putin. So that also seemed to add to the ratcheted up anti-Russia rhetoric. Well, thank you all for being with us this hour. We'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, NBC News Now coverage. We'll continue with my friend Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.